Thank you for bearing with us. It's always slightly difficult if we have a changeover between one meeting and another. We'll start with apologies for absence. I know there's an apology from Councillor Fuller.
And Councillor Sparks.
Councillor Sparks. Do we accept those apologies?
Yes.
Second item on the agenda is a representation from interested party. This is Mr. Tim Burt, who's going to give us a relatively short presentation, given the length of this agenda, on the proposed development of the site off Barnwell Road.
We've got a proposed building project for the Barnwell Road opposite and next to the marina. The site was formerly what was the Lost Village of Crowthorpe, which is in the Lost Villages of Northamptonshire. Along the front piece, I would like to put terraced small cottages, and then the maps that are present on the table there replicate the Lost Village of Hamlet, and the bottom part of the land, so that it's a 50-50 split, would be turned into a wetland nature reserve, which could be used in keeping with Barnwell Country Park. And the lakes that are proposed at the bottom, because it falls into flood zones 2 and 3, they're balancing lakes and dry bed ponds, which will counteract the footprint of the building that's currently there. It will be aesthetically in keeping with all of the houses that are proposed in stone with the correct slate roofs. There will be a village green, and on the land at the moment, as you go into the field, on the left-hand side there is currently a stone wall which has been there since 1192, and that was formerly the toll house as you entered Oundle. The Barnwell Road was known as Grover's Road, and the bridge just before you come in was called Crowthorpe Bridge. So, with replicating what was there before, I would like to rebuild the toll house. There has been a lot of fines that have all been catalogued with the Northampton Archives, all of which I have got with me. And these fines would form part of a museum linked to Oundle Museum, and the toll house will be rebuilt, recreated, and then used for the town. And as you came in over the bridge, all of the cottages on your right-hand side will be replicated along the front, so that it will be in keeping as you came in. And the larger houses which are on the map there that are set back will all be of stone, and there's only about 40 to 48 houses on a 10-acre site, which will be very least populated, hence the development will be a little bit different to a lot that are proposed at the moment. And fingers crossed, it's something that you feel would be an asset to Oundle. It wouldn't be detrimental, it would be environmentally and aesthetically correct and in keeping. So if you'd like to have a look at the maps and let me know any thoughts.
Can I ask one thing?
Yeah.
And obviously, unfortunately, having the background in the NP as I have, the density would never pass plans.
In what reason?
Well, the density of housing now has between 30 and 35 per hectare.
Yeah.
You're planning 48 for the whole site.
Only the top part of the site is to be developed.
Unfortunately, they don't look at that part. They still sometimes take that in. So you have to be very careful on the density of the part that you are actually building.
Right, okay. How many houses would you suggest would be?
Well, what's the actual size of the site?
It's 10 acres.
10 acres.
Yeah.
And you're doing 5 acres.
No, the whole site is 19.8.
Oh, right, so it's 10 acres, it's 48 houses.
Yes.
I'm not trying to be horrible, I'm not trying to disappoint you, but on the present plans that the council or ENC have, right, on 10 acres, let's see, hold on, that's how many hectares in an acre? It's about 5, isn't it?
Just under.
Yeah, so let's say 5 in round figures. Okay, you times that by 30, that's 150. You've got 10 acres, they want you to build almost 1,500 houses.
No, I think your maths is wrong, please.
No, it's not, is it?
Yeah.
Is it? Sorry, have I got it wrong?
Yes. It's a lot, but it's not that much.
It's not 1,500. Sorry, my apologies. I'm doing it in my head quickly.
Yeah.
But it's still well over the 48 houses.
Oh, definitely. It's just because I wanted to keep it in keeping with Oundle as it is at the moment.
No, I appreciate that, and it's fantastic that you're thinking about
And
that.
I'd rather have less houses, which is rather unusual for a developer. They want as many as they can get, whereas I would rather have as few and make them in keeping with the local area.
I think what you've got to do is actually look look to the planners at ENC to find out what their thoughts are.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously it's great to have 48 houses and the terraced houses and affordable houses as well.
That's what I've got the cottages to go for,
Yeah.
the council.
That would be
housing in the
absolutely,
front.
yeah, that would be absolutely brilliant. I have no objection to that. And to make it look like a village is even greater, better. And I like the situation where you've got your wetlands and your ponds, etc., which would blend in obviously with Barnwell Park. No objection to that at all. But I think you do need to have a closer study on the density situation.
Discussed with the planners, the ENC, because have you talked about
I've been to Regional Planners Council, and basically they recommended, I came and spoke to Barnwell and Oundle to get everybody's views really.
They didn't come up with the same.
They personally didn't know. They said the density of the land would basically be down to Oundle and Barnwell and everywhere else really that decided.
But that's not true. ENC have the last word on density. We don't.
Well, it doesn't. Does it surprise you that ENC says one thing to one person and says something different to us? Because it doesn't surprise me.
Just as a point to that, I think you'll find that the plan is great and it looks fantastic, and I applaud the effort that's gone into it. But I think you'll find that you will be forced to build more and more and more on that site, as for the reasons you stated. And how you don't have to build them, but how stalwart would you be and robust against the challenge that you must build more?
I didn't want it to look like a modern housing estate because of Oundle being the historical market town. I wanted to keep it in keeping with the local area. I don't mind a little bit more density on land. However, I don't want it to turn into a housing estate where it looks like everything
Well, how
else.
rigorous would you be with that? Would you be prepared to throw the whole thing out rather than go down the route of...
It would all depend on their density, to be honest.
This is a floodplain.
It is.
There is an existence already, a report by the Department of the Environment saying that it must never be built on.
When I had a meeting with the Environment Agency, they did say to me that it does fall into flood zones 2 and 3, and the only thing that they did say was, with those balancing lakes and dry bed ponds, if I could counteract the surface area of which was built on, with others to equal the floodplain, they would consider it and look into it, which is why I've
I'm
included...
just telling you that there's a report
Oh, definitely.
that says it must never ever be built on. Just to,
Yeah.
we'll have to do quite a lot of work.
I certainly will. I've had a lot of meetings with the Environment Agency over Tetrid and spent a lot of hours there. And the only thing they suggested to me was if I could create somewhere to hold water that would be equal to the building land. So, but I must admit, I didn't experience with East Northants anything to do with the density, to be honest. They didn't.
You will.
Yeah, they did tell me they said to speak to obviously Barnwell and Oundle to get more views.
No, it looks terrific. It looks a terrific proposition, but I think you really do need to go back to ENC and I don't know whether you can do a pre-app before you go any further.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to see. If there was major objections, obviously within Oundle and Barnwell and people before I do my pre-app, and basically get your views of what you thought on it before I handed in a pre-app.
Councillor
Can I just say, it's very refreshing. Thank you very much for bringing it to us, and I hope you have success.
Thank you very much.
I'm going
Sorry to be a downer.
No. It wasn't what I expected. I thought you wouldn't want housing there to be more.
Just another point, you must recognise, sorry.
I think I'm going to stop it simply because we've got so much to do.
Right, okay.
What I would like to do is in fact put a discussion of this committee on this matter on the next agenda, because we can't do it tonight, there just isn't going to be an opportunity. And if you wished to come to our next meeting, which will be on the first Tuesday in December, whenever that is, then you'd be very welcome.
Perfect.
But thank you for that.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I'm sorry in a sense to have to curtail it, but I'm just very, very conscious of the fact that our preliminary timescales would finish this side of midnight just. And I said, well, we're going to have to do a bit better than that. So, on to declarations of interest. Are there any disclosable pecuniary interests in respect of any of the applications?
Actually, I sent an email to ask you to speak at the meeting to Emma last Friday.
You did.
Yeah.
That's quite right. It isn't actually on here.
I can either do it now or when the particular application comes up.
No, it's probably better that we do it at this point. Forgive me, Nadine, I completely forgot. It's not marked up on the agenda, but I saw what you sent in, and I said we must have it on the agenda. So, yes, quickly, please.
Right, I'm speaking on behalf of the resident tenant houses at the back of St Christopher's Drive. Our properties were bought knowing there could possibly be housing at the back, but never with the thought that a huge 4-storey care facility would be at the back of us in the middle of a residential area. If such a facility is required for Oundle, then it needs to be considered on a town basis with an appropriate site a lot bigger than this one. The facility on this site is ill-conceived, out of scale to its surroundings, and makes no proper consideration as to the amount of servicing that will require. Policy 8 of the North Northamptonshire Joint Core Strategy requires, as I quote, development should ensure quality of life and safer, healthier communities by protecting existing communities and not result in an unacceptable impact on future occupiers. Neighbouring properties or the wider area by reason of noise, vibration, light or other pollution, loss of light or overlooking. The positioning of the care facility will contravene this policy. This very tall building will have considerable adverse and detrimental effects on our houses, as it is so close to the houses and will overlook and dominate our gardens, conservatories and houses itself. It will be totally out of keeping. Our houses are about 6.5 metres tall. This building will be about 13.6 and more with the need for machinery. Windows at the back will look directly into our gardens and houses. There will be no privacy and the facility will just dominate us and probably, because of its height, be seen from across the road into the rest of our current estate and well into Oundle. We are concerned about the additional disruption which will happen during the building. Long term, there will be disruption caused by staff coming and going at all hours to the parking at the back of the building along our boundaries. Parking which is inadequate for the staffing required. The use of security lighting to the building, lights in corridors and the general noise from machinery required for the running of this facility, particularly at night, with some of this machinery likely to be on the roof. The facility will need deep foundations due to the height, size and weight of the building, and this could cause structural damage to our properties because of their very close proximity. Our gardens are currently on a small bank of loose soil overlooking the site, and this could become unstable and lead to possible subsidence problems. There are likely to be surface water drainage problems and disruption due to the need for raft construction and piling. This would be a very busy facility needing many staff and generating considerable traffic, not what 12 people nearby would ever envisage. In conclusion, this is not a sensible and sustainable business plan for a care home. The service provision has not been thought through and the whole proposal is totally out of scale to its surroundings and would be the largest non-commercial building in the town squeezed into a residential site of individual houses. We believe that the rules have been changed significantly to the long-standing plan that was proposed as late as July 2019, without due recourse to the wishes of local residents and the town in general.
Thank you. Sorry we didn't call you on in the first place. We'll obviously be looking at the representations that we've just heard when we come on to the relevant planning application, which is actually number 2 on our list anyway. Right, I'll have a second crack at disclosable pecuniary interests. Are there any?
Declare that I'm a resident of St Christopher's Drive, which is on the agenda today.
I'm a resident of St Peter's Road, which is on the agenda.
Bexley Drive and to the new yoga centre at the Wharf.
And
Right.
very quickly, 38
Don't often get those.
38 West Street, Colsage Yard. I've long-standing friendship with the owners there.
Would you kindly add me to that as well?
It's a bit quicker to have asked if anybody didn't have disclosable pecuniary interest. Right, any other interests?
Sorry, I possibly have to also declare that I'm part of the Green Spaces group in Handel when it comes round to Fletton Field.
Right, that's probably...
That's mine.
That's it.
Well, so far I think it's only now Val and I who haven't declared an interest. I can't think of one that I can come up with.
Well, at least we're interested in animals.
I'd have to declare a connection to our school if we're talking about a tree,
We are.
a sycamore tree.
So, right.
Or maybe very vital.
Well, I still can't think of an interest that I can declare. So,
David, don't worry, we'll think of one.
I'm sure you'll come up with something before the meeting's over. Right, let's move on. Last of the formal bits. Minutes of the meeting on the 1st of October. They have been circulated. Present myself, Councillor Chesser, Councillor Fuller, Councillor Humphreys and Councillor Neville Oakes and Councillor Sue Oakes. Do I have anybody who proposed them? Councillor Oakes S, seconded. Councillor Humphreys. All those in favour who were there? Fine. Right, bear with me whilst I just sign them. Right. Now there are a very considerable number of planning applications to try and get through. I've had a discussion with Councillor Neville Oakes about the way we're going to try and handle certainly the first two. Well, we've discussed all of them in one way, form or another. But for no reason other than the fact that it appears on our list first, we'll start with the Cotterstock Road development, which is an outline planning application for the erection of up to 130 dwellings with public open space, landscaping, sustainable drainage and vehicular access points from Cotterstock Road and St Peter's Road.
Just as a preamble, I appreciate that this was going to be a bit hefty, and I'm trying to look at this very much at more of a strategic level than going down and drilling down into the detail. I'm grateful for the presentation that the lady put about the particular issues was, Christopher's Drive, and indeed I've actually read the Nellie Nidwit's observations about that. But, okay, so I've done my best to keep it as simple as I can. Okay, I'm just explaining SUDS, everybody knows what SUDS is. So there you go.
We do.
Right, there's the sites, and
Can we get rid of that?
Yeah, it'll go off.
well,
What does it say?
Anyone, if it goes off, don't shout at me.
hold on.
In case it does it again.
Which button did you hit?
Number one of them.
All right, so I think we've looked at the sites anyway. This was the planning concept, which was put up from the design and access statement. And you can see the sites. Now, I put that just up just to show you the complexity of this. There's an awful lot of documents and an awful lot of comments. And we can't possibly wade through all that, not this evening anyway. Okay. I put my own little satellite image up, because very conveniently, maybe, the school appears to have been sort of slightly ignored, but that's where it is. There's also the possibility, but that's still up in the air and round about, the properties may be built on that area next to the school. Well, we don't know about that for certain yet. Okay, many and varied. Now, I've gone through all of these. I couldn't find a positive one. We obviously appreciate the need for care homes, but is this the right place to put one? We have neighbouring councils who've objected along with us. That's Cotswold and Blackpool. The development is at odds with our neighbourhood plan. Well, you can read that. Proximity to the school is problematical, as is the impact upon houses and roads in the area. And the proposed access is largely blind motorists. Now, school traffic, as you know, if you're up there at that particular time, 2 times a day, safety of children in the area, that drop off and pick up has got to be paramount. And it's pretty dodgy around there.
Okay.
There are many more concerns. It is a complex matter, and I'd like to say that your planning committee, we're always on hand to field and pass on your comments as best we can. And basically, we've objected, and by and large, the alterations that we put in doesn't change our opinion. Would that be fair to say?
Well, I think councillors will be aware that we have already objected to the principle of development on this site. I think the key thing is whether or not anything that's come forward now alters our view one jot about it. Those who were present during the earlier neighbourhood plan full council meeting will have already heard us making it very clear as a council that at this point we stand by the housing allocations that we put into our neighbourhood plan, notwithstanding the difficulties that have arisen in connection with it. We do not favour development on this particular site for a whole raft of reasons. And to some extent, my view is that there's no point in rehearsing the same arguments as we've already had. So all I'm really interested in is whether anybody has read anything in these papers that makes them feel that it alters in any way the views that we've previously expressed, because we don't have to go and repeat word for word what we've already said. That's already on record. It's only if we want to add something in relation to this. What we may want to do, as a matter of formality, of course, is simply reinstate all our previous objections, and perhaps in a way that may feature on other matters on this agenda, potentially to support objections that are being raised by individual members of the public representing the town of Oundle. Councillor Peel.
The only thing I'd mention is that on the Cosstock Road site, I'm talking about the Cosstock Road site between Blackthorn and Oundle, not the nursing home further down the Cosstock Road. There is no nursing home on the unless they've redone it again. I didn't think there was a nursing home on the Cosstock Road site.
No.
I don't think there is.
Well, you
It's your first line.
It's your first line.
What?
Need positive, although the need for care homes is
Yeah,
acknowledged.
that's a general comment.
Oh, right, so it's
It's
not,
just a
it's not to
general
do
one,
with
it's
the...
not specific to the site.
Okay, sorry, I
Yeah.
I
misunderstood.
mean, we've gone care home, all
Yeah, yeah.
the way through these
Yeah, yeah.
presentations.
Okay.
I'm merely making a general comment that we acknowledge that care homes are important.
Right.
But is this the right place to put this one?
Except there isn't one on this site.
There isn't, no, there isn't.
Yeah. So let's not
Not yet.
let's not confuse the issue.
No.
There
Okay,
is,
no, I'm not
just in
trying
case
to
any member of
confuse
the
you, I'm
public is
just trying to
confused,
understand
there
it.
is no plan put before ENC for the erection of a care home
I
on
didn't
this
know
site.
there'd been
It
an
has
update.
been talked about by the developers before now, but it isn't in the new plans, it wasn't in the old plans. Councillor Peel's quite right, there was an application to put a care facility on the site of the burnt-out house on Cotterstock Road, the former home of the Sloanes. That was opposed by this council. It was rejected by the ENC, and as we will see later, has been refused on appeal as well. So, Is there any other specific point in relation to the Cotterstock Road site that anybody wishes to raise?
Can we go back to the first map, please? One of the
Which one? Sorry, tell me which.
That one there.
Right, okay.
There are two things that I think are relevant from that map originally that we could raise with ENC. That's the one that's still on various websites, which shows a secondary route coming on St Peter's Road. But on most of the stuff, particularly the stuff that was put out to the community, the original community involvement discussion plan and put in back in May and June, that was just pedestrian or cycle. And now they've made it into their secondary route, but they say that 70% of the vehicle traffic, car traffic, will be going on through there. And that's going to have a huge impact down onto New Road and then onto Station Road. I very boringly sat in my car over half term counting cars. At the same time as the traffic assessment they've put forward, and I think the numbers are seriously out. They also raise various questions about the ability of St Peter's Road and New Road to cope with more traffic. But I think, again, some of the stuff they put forward actually raises technical issues about how much traffic those roads can cope with. So that's something we won't be able to raise. And the fact that the community involvement that they looked at is not the plan they're finally putting forward.
Yes. It's a fair point. I'm well aware of the issues on that road, not least because I used to live on that road, backing onto that site. And I also spent a little time when the first application went in one Sunday, counting the number of cars that were parked on the new road stretch by the recreation ground and then down St Peter's Road because of the rugby club. And it was an astronomical number, and it represented a pretty unmobile chicane. I mean, it's quite tricky at the best of times. On Sundays it's even worse, and it's probably appropriate, in fact, for us in making the points that we've already said to raise as an additional concern whether or not the proposed second access off St Peter's Road, I can see why they've done it, and of course there is a roadway entrance there to the site, but I think the point is that the amount of car usage has increased considerably since that estate was developed in the 1960s, and consequently if you put 130 houses on there and most of them disgorge that way, if that was the way they went, and it would potentially be the natural way to go if you were trying to make your way out to the A605 in Peterborough, it is going to cause, I agree with you, a lot of issues on the current junction with New Road. And you can't alter the priority because you can hardly force vehicles coming down New Road to actually have to stop to let the traffic come the other way. So that's going to be an issue, and then the junction out by Picarthy is hardly suitable. Councillor Lane.
There's a danger of becoming a rat run between Cotterstock Road and the bridge. And that'll even put even more traffic down it.
Yeah, it's nearly a kilometre shorter to go that way than all the way down by New Road, so a lot of traffic.
And you don't have all the congestion, town or anything else. So.
Councillor Pearce.
I would, at this moment in time, at the examination, it was made clear to us that Highways had given the all clear for those two ways into the estate. This is NCC, not ENC. So, although I agree with you entirely, and I can see you making the point, I don't think the ENC planners will take any notice of that particular point because they already have clearance from NCC.
Two of the documents that have come forward since we wrote about our concerns in September try and deal with NCC's concern actually, and they actually say that there's a phrase that I can't remember exactly what it is off the top of my head, I'm afraid, but their planning highways guy from Northants was concerned about the whole network of roads in and around there, and Gladden put a 30-page report attacking that. but I don't think they fundamentally do successfully.
Well, if we can get that report into our objectives to the planning application, that might be really very strong stuff.
Quite a lot.
It does actually occur to me that, bearing in mind that part of this site is actually in Glapthorne, I should perhaps have said that I declare an interest
We've got you.
as a member of the Glapthorne Parish Council as well as of Oundle Town Council. Glapthorne having objected to this as well.
There we go. We've got you now.
So, yes, so there was one. Right. Are there any other comments?
Well, I think, you know, because it's not in the Oundle neighbourhood plan, we need to make that point first. And, you know, if anything, the consideration of this site needs to be delayed until we have the outcome of the neighbourhood plan and the local plan too is agreed. What I would also like to do is take the opportunity of using the document that I showed earlier to append to whatever we respond, because that is the logic that Oundle applied to why we deselected this site.
I would also say as well that obviously it would be a lot stronger objection to this planning application if we could actually get Glapthorne to write a joint letter with with Oundle Council objecting this site, because it is on both sides.
The short practical answer to that is that they have already objected.
Yeah.
That I can tell you. But the timescales don't suit us, because we've actually got an extension till tomorrow, as far as I can recollect, by which to respond. So it slightly ties our hands as to what we can and can't practically do. But we could certainly, in our own further response, draw attention to the fact that the neighbouring parish of Glapthorne has also objected strongly to this proposed development.
The highways report into the objection tomorrow?
It's on the report already, but the phrase they use is that they're concerned about the impact on the existing constrained network, which is narrow, without much opportunity for improvement. And they have concerns over the trip rates in the transport assessment. So, trip rates.
Okay.
Councillor Rhodes.
I mean, the objections from Cotswold and Glapthorne are pretty, you know,
Strong,
yeah, they're strong. I don't know whether we'll be able to say much more than that. I mean, it's like I was doing all this stuff as to whether you put it up or don't put it up. You know, we could be here all night if we went through every single thing that I've waded through in the last couple of weeks. But Cotswold and Glapthorne are saying, don't like this.
So I'm keen that we give our councillor colleagues in ENC the strongest remit, that we at least want the site deferred. Yeah, we want judgment on this deferred until after the local plan and neighbourhood plan have gone their course.
And general election.
Yeah, but longer than that. Yeah, but we definitely need those two plans to work their way through, and there isn't a pressing need for housing before those plans.
Yeah, I mean, it's reiterating a point that was made earlier this evening. But although this site is mentioned in the Rural North Oundle and Thrapston plan, which is still the existing local plan, it was simply flagged up as a possible site for future development outside that plan period, which doesn't of itself end until 2021.
Yes, right.
And therefore there is a case for saying that so long as there is an adequate land supply within the district, you shouldn't be trying to bring forward development from what might be described as the next development phase and bring it forward early.
Yeah.
So can I ask, and as I say, I don't come to many planning meetings, as you know, I tend to sort of leave that to you anyway. But so we're going to get a letter to ENC tomorrow?
Well, we have to file our formal response. What tends to happen on a night like this is that I go home, sit at my computer and produce some wording for our clerk tonight, so that when she comes to actually submit it tomorrow, she's got the wording rather than having to try and work out herself how it should be worded.
No, that's great.
So the plan is, I'm going to have a late night,
Let's have a look.
because I'm going to have to draft this when I get back.
Yeah, great. Smashing. Thank you, David. Just for clarity there.
Sadly, it might not be the only one I've got to draft tonight either.
Probably not.
Right, any more on this, or can we move on to St Christopher's Drive, which, strangely enough, is yet another outline planning application, this time for the erection of up to 65 dwellings and an extra care facility of up to 65 units on land at St Christopher's Drive, Oundle, all matters being reserved, except access. And again, we are in precisely the same boat. We have already objected to development on this site. These are some slightly revised paperwork. Again, this of course is a site which does not feature in our neighbourhood plan housing allocation, which we stand by.
Can I go back to this? Obviously, this plan was changed between the neighbourhood plan being published and Caroline Tate getting involved with the planning. Now, she approached 3 sites to find out if they could do a care home. Those 3 sites were St Christopher's, Coscott Road and David Wilson. None of those, the two out of the first 2 were not in our plan. So she shouldn't approach these developers in the first place. So that's the first objection to this plan tonight, because it was premature. They should not have been asked to even put a plan in, because they knew that the neighbourhood plan had been allowed to go forward, and that the local plan was delayed or deferred until the neighbourhood plan had been either rejected, done through the referendum, whatever. But they haven't done that. They've actually gone in ahead and not dealt to talk to either of the other sites on our site. So, for instance, Herne Road wasn't talked to, Benefield Road wasn't talked to. So those 2 sites and the other 2 sites that were big enough to take a care home, Caroline Tate did not at any time go to those sites and ask them to put a care home in. The reason, obviously, one of the main reasons that Persimmon have decided to put a care home into the St Christopher's Drive site is because it stops them then having to have 40% affordable homes. So that was the main reason for this to be done. The second reason is that they thought they could get this care home through on the planning, so that they could get the other 65 houses. Now, as I understand the situation, is that Persimmon are not actually building this care home. They're actually going to be selling the land to somebody else to build. So at the moment they've swapped the site from where it was on the 605, because obviously they knew the people that the neighbourhood plan had objected to this, and they've put it back to back behind St Christopher's Drive, which is a bit naughty, to say the very least.
Yeah.
So I think we should really be objecting heavily on this. The other thing is, and I say this, whether this will happen or not, I have a feeling that once they've got the planning, the nursing home will disappear, and there'll be another 65 houses built there, not a nursing home.
Right.
Strong stuff.
Before anybody else talks about it, can I just ask Neville to put up some pictures for us?
Okay, well, I'm horribly familiar with this site for various reasons, but I think you know where it is, and there's only one way in and out. Now, this was a previous application. I've been around long enough to know this one. This was an application, I'm putting it in blue because it's not really part of this particular application, but there was a residential development of up to 95 houses put in 2013, and after a long, there it is. It was a very long and protracted. If you go and have a look at the 130125, you'll see it goes appeal, 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 and there's an awful lot of barristers involved. But basically, it was refused. Now, I don't know if that's got anything to do with this, but who knows? That's the sort of planned layout they're proposing, and you can see that being done on the southwestern side of the site, which is where they propose to put a care home. Right, I think this is really pretty damning, and it comes back to what was said earlier. There's only some access via St Christopher's Drive, and that is, the blue one, is the proposed care home, which is, and attaches up to 4 stories. The orangey bits are up to 2.5, and the other bits, which are at the front, are only 2. Right. Just for fun and games, that's the detail of all the bits and pieces, that's the internal guidance. But, you know, we're not, I suppose, really interested in how these would be laid out from our perspective. We're only interested in the exterior. And don't forget there's going to be a roof on it as well. Right. Okay. This is what you're facing. 41 comments, 72 documents. There's a whole load of stuff on there already. But I've done what I call, I've just got a short summary rather than rattle through all of that. It doesn't fit with our neighbourhood plan, it's out of scale. The total building detrimental 13.6, whilst the surrounding house 6.5, the point was made earlier. Inadequate parking, noise and light imposition. Single access and egress day and night through the existing residential area. And there's also the issue of construction traffic. And there are other things I could have added to it, but you know, you could keep going and going and going with this one. That's next. So we'll go back to that. I've little more to say. We don't like it at all.
It might just, I will come bring you in a moment. Just to sort of focus our minds, it wasn't that long ago that there was a planning application for a very tall care facility just out there.
Yes.
Which, as I recall our response to it, was it might be a facility that we need, but it isn't in the right place because of the impact that it would have had on the listed building that lies just the other side of the car park, and indeed on the school chapel and memorial gardens and so on, and we took considerable exception to the size of that. I have to say that was another application that ended up going nowhere. So we might want to bear in mind, in a sense from the point of view of consistency, that we may very well take the view that actually if that was out of scale for where that was, this is arguably considerably more out of scale for where it is, bearing in mind its proximity to existing properties.
Well, I'm just hoping for a bit of clarification about what sort of extra care facility we're talking about. Are we talking about units of houses, homes to be sold to people, flats? Because that's what extra care is. No, it's not about a care home, because people are using...
You're dead right, Bob. It is about by having flats there that people
it's
can
not,
buy.
It's not a care home
for
people who can't look after themselves.
It's an extra care home where people buy in and they can only buy if they need some sort of care but are still able to get around themselves.
Yeah.
It's just literally that sort of scheme.
Semi-independent living is, I think, one of the
yes.
current buzz phrases. Yes.
People are also using the word care home and things. And
yes.
That's not what we're talking about.
A fair point.
David, just for clarity, with my declared interest, am I allowed to talk on this subject?
I can't see why you can't talk about it, but it might be wiser if you didn't vote on it.
Okay.
Were we to get to any kind of a vote.
Okay, so I'd just like to get clarity over that last conversation then. They seem to be taking advantage over parking allocations In a care home, it's assumed that most of the residents don't have cars and can't drive. In an extra care facility, they are mobile, and therefore they need car parking. And in this allocation, they've taken the parking spaces for a care home, so they've said there's 1 parking space per 3 flats. So there isn't enough parking on the site that they've got. So they're taking advantage of the wording.
And people being confused about it.
Would it be fair to say that, rather like the last application, we reiterate our previous objections to any development of this site, making the point that the Mayor has previously made, that perhaps consideration of any application on here would be premature given the state of play of the existing local plan and where we are with local plan part 2 and our own neighbourhood plan. But perhaps going beyond that, to raise our concerns, rather in line with the presentation we heard earlier, about the noise, the light pollution, the dominating effect of the structure, the lack of parking. Indeed, there are so many different grounds for saying this is a rotten idea. In my view, the question is almost what you leave out rather than what you put in. But would anybody demur from that kind of a response?
No.
Right. I'll draft you that one as well.
You're doing well, David.
I know, yes. Right.
Okay.
On the basis that somehow we've ended up with every conceivable controversial planning application in sight, number 3 just happens to be land at the rear of Abbott House and 1 to 3 Blackthorn Road, which is not a million miles from this building, and might echo slightly the conversation that I had a minute or 2 ago about a previous application. This is the development of, would you believe, 33 extra care apartments for older people with associated access, parking, community green space and landscaping, and essentially the site might become familiar to you when Councillor Oates shows it.
There you go. It's Fletton Field. Clearly there are lots of issues surrounding that, and that's the proposal. Basically, they're going to take it over, really, and leave a tiny bit of green left, but put in, well, the apartments are going to be overlooked more or less by 2 Grade 2 listed buildings, the chapel and Magdalen and Malvern House. Don't know what much to say, really.
Councillor Chester.
Can I say there's a history of Angle Town Council fighting any kind of development on this property?
Well, it would be somewhat inconsistent of us not to object to this application, bearing in mind the stance that we've taken in relation to Fletton Field as a council and the support that we have to the group that tries to, or is trying to ensure that Fletton Field is preserved as an open green space for this town. So I rather suspect that our view is that any form of development on there, be it this or be it anything else, is unacceptable. Having made that point, the question is, on planning grounds, apart from our objection, as it were, to the site, what would be specific reasons for objecting? Now, Councillor Oates has mentioned the impact on listed buildings, which I think should not be minimised. But are there other matters that we should raise, Councillor Oates?
Well, the original, well, NCC are really trying to sort of shoehorn this in here. They put in an original application, which some of us will remember, to put 30 residential developments up. We didn't like that at all, and certainly Angle School didn't like it. And it would appear anyway that also that Angle School didn't like the look of this at all either. They can be sometimes a little bit annoying, but they can be of a great value in supporting what we try to do. We're in a bit of a cleft stick over this because obviously we've got a community value piece of grass which is going to be largely covered. We don't like that. I I wonder what NCC are going to come up with next.
And of course, if they got planning on this, the answer is nothing. But Peter,
Actually, I actually agree with the site. I think we should have it develop 33 extra care homes. I'm afraid I don't see Fletton Field as a field site. We need to have a care home in Oundle, whether you like it or not. We have to put a care home in Oundle.
I don't think there's anybody in this room that disagrees with that statement, Peter. It's about location.
Close to the town centre. It would be ideal for the type of care home that they're sorting about. I'm sorry to be the one that's crucified on this, because I know I will be. But you know, I don't see any other sites where we could put a care home. We've objected to the Persimmon estate, which I totally agree with. We've objected to the Costerstock Road one. Right? We have no other sites here that we can put a care home at the moment within easy walking distance. This is the only field we have.
Councillor, what are you talking about? The application is for extra care apartments.
Yes, I know.
You're talking about...
Sorry, extra care apartment.
I mean, I've already just answered
It's an extra care home.
It's not,
It's an extra care apartment. So
not a care home.
I agree. I'm sorry, I misused my
So,
language.
that's a completely different...
Yes, I do. I agree with you entirely.
all right. It may be that, given that we have had a contrary view expressed, can I just invite councillors to indicate whether they are opposed in principle to any development on Fletton Field at the present time?
I'm opposed in principle.
Right. I'm afraid Councillor Pearley were probably right.
I knew,
you appear to be in a minority of one.
I knew I would be. I have no objection to being voted down. I just feel that
I understand why you say what you said, and it does occur to me that in an earlier meeting this evening there was a motion to go and have a conversation with the Chief Executive at ENC, and it does occur to me that one of the subjects that might potentially be raised is this issue of the provision of care/extra care facilities within the town, and some thought should be given perhaps by this council, but I suspect not tonight, as to whether there are in fact more suitable sites than those which have so far been proposed. And Councillor Beale's quite right. We felt that the site in Costerstock Road had a whole string of disadvantages and said no to it. Slightly different facility to this one. We've just given the thumbs down to the facility at St Christopher's Drive, and it's pretty clear that we're about to give the thumbs down in a big way to this one. But I doubt that any of us here would say that the type of facility that is proposed is not right for this town. Indeed, I suspect all of us would say it would be a valuable addition to the town if we could secure it, provided it were in the right place. The question might well be, where is the right place? And that, I suspect, might well be a subject we should return to either within this committee or perhaps within full council. Depending on what the agenda looks like for the next full council meeting, I might decide to ask that it's put on there. Okay. It would appear that because we're objecting to development in principle, we object, and I think that there are issues with regard clearly to the location, not just because it's Fletton Field and it's green space, but because of its potential impact on listed buildings. We raised the issue in relation to St Christopher's Drive about parking, and the very useful point that was made that of course you need to provide more parking in an extra care facility because it's more likely people will use it, which begs the question as to whether frankly there is enough parking provided for within this plan. And secondly, of course, if there are going to be movements, it's a question of where it moves to. And it occurs to me that no doubt highways will take a different view to this council, since they seem to frequently do so, but I suspect that the majority of us would be slightly concerned about any significant numbers of vehicles coming out onto Glapthorne Road. Would I be right? So we might very well express that view whether we get support from highways or not. Are there any other issues with regard to this development that we would like to incorporate?
One's a slightly technical one, that when it says a potential asset of community value, it is an asset of, it's not no potential to it, it is an asset.
It's just not being understated, is more or less what I'm saying.
The other one is, just on your
Yes.
point there, David, about parking.
Actually, Tony says it has been.
It is an asset of community value currently. That is why, indeed,
Yeah.
they had to go through the process, because they couldn't just offer it for sale on the open market. They tried to, but then we pointed out to them that there were certain legal constraints, and they did eventually accept with a certain amount of ill grace that they couldn't do it.
So the other issue over parking, and again, we're talking about, these are people that are mobile, these are people that do drive cars. However, there will be a higher proportion of them which actually use disabled parking spaces. And in this plan, there are only 3 disabled parking spaces in the whole plan. And it just highlights the issue about how much space you have to have dedicated to cars with this type of facility. And this is, again, playing a planning role of 1 minute calling it a care home and the next calling it an extra care home. They want one set of rules when they're putting the space out and another set of rules when they're selling them on to for value. So there's not enough parking spaces in there for the type of resident who are using the facility. And just on Peter's point about brownfield sites, many people in the town have told me that the most useful brownfield site in that part of town at the moment is the old primary school. If we could get the church to agree to its reuse as an extra care home, it's ideally located, and it's got an awful lot of character to it.
Right. Any other points? Councillor Farr.
One of the objections notes that the access land is owned by someone else. Is that an issue or not an issue? The access land, where the proposed access to Glapthorne Road is actually owned by our school, so vested interest, but it's on the Berries letter, and it's owned by someone else, so the car parking spaces aren't an issue for car getting.
It's helipad on the roof. It's one of those quirks of planning law that, of course, you can put in a planning application in respect to land you don't even own. It might be an interesting concept that if Andal School object to the development and somehow NCC think that they're going to persuade Andal School to allow them access over it, strokes get them to sell it to them, they may well be disabused. It might raise one other issue. It's not strictly, arguably, a planning issue, but it's just sheer common sense, and of course the two don't always coincide. But we're well aware that Northamptonshire County Council will cease to exist. It will become an extinct council, to slightly misquote Monty Python.
I'm sorry,
And there is
I have to go now, David. So
well, thank you for your contribution.
I'll be later. I'll see you. Speak to you tomorrow.
There will be those who say that, frankly, NCC should not be offloading its assets at this point in its limited lifestyle, because it should be for its successor council to decide what use to make of those assets rather than for them to sell it off. Now, whether that's a point that we might want to make in more general terms, and perhaps to direct towards our county councillor, and perhaps towards those brave people who are putting their names forward to stand as parliamentary candidates for this constituency, it might well be that we should raise that issue with them, even though it's probably not one that the planners themselves can take into account. Anybody think that that might be sensible?
I do believe it's sensible, and when I look at some of the comments on the website, there's an awful lot of people who made that point already, that the land does not belong to them. It was bought by the people of Andal, and nobody ever bought it off us.
Right. I think I've got a flavour. have a feeling that might be 3 I've got to write up now. Pexley Court. Pexley Court has produced its own raft of issues, actually, of late, but here is another planning application for the land at Pexley Court.
Just quickly, I'll leave you with that, because that might help you with your letter.
Maybe. And my apologies again for omitting to call you.
Yeah.
Oh, right, okay, well, I've got 2 copies. Right, I think we'll let members of the public just make a dignified retreat.
Nick, I haven't school got anything to do with that bit, I since Madison Street coming in.
It was sold to the school, but with rights still to the access. That's
Was it?
why it's because I highlighted that. I'll raise it in that plan.
There was enough of it without digging anywhere.
Right, bearing in mind that we've so far reached planning application number 4 of 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 13, 14, 15, 16, so we're a quarter of the way through in an hour and a bit. Shall we press on?
Some of them are very straightforward.
Yeah.
Thank goodness for that. Pexley Court.
Right, Pexley Court, right, okay. Now, that was the original one, it's, there are actually 3. We never discussed them at the time. That was the original one. That's the location, you can see it there. Now I'm running through basically what we looked at before. And as you can see, there are trees, all over it. You know, some have got borders on them. In fact, quite a lot of them have. This is basically the photograph of the access into Bexley Court, which is down there, the road on the, you see on the left, and right, and that's the entrance. And then we've got, that's number 70 Benfield Road, and then you can see some other pictures which basically show trees. Okay, the proposed site layout now is that. This has been modified as a result of waste management people wanting to know where their bins were. And as you can see, there's only now 2 properties proposed instead of the original 3. Stop me a while ago. And that property was originally the garden for 62 Benfield Road. Right, here are the plans. To be honest, I don't think we need to be unduly concerned about the plans, because I don't think we have an issue with the actual buildings themselves as such. Were they built on a nice flat site somewhere with no trees? They would appear to fit in nicely. That's the sort of thing they're looking at doing, the sort of stuff you'd expect in for, you know, sort of modern houses. There's a, you know, that sort of basic look and feel, and you're dealing with, you know, the sort of thing that would blend in to the surroundings. Right, this is the big one now. I'll put the arrow there, and it says trees to be removed. Now, it's not very easy to see it on here, but there's a lot of them. There's a lot of trees. There potentially, I believe, could be as many as 40 taken down. The only way that this application would be successful would be if those trees could go, because they're in the way. They've been there a long time. And they're also a useful habitat for all sorts of creatures, you know, this, that and the other. But I think it's important to understand that this is very much about, you know, trees. That's pretty much it.
I recall that when we discussed this before, there was considerable concern around the trees and the impact of developing 3 properties on that side.
Yep.
And it seems relatively clear from what we've just heard that even if we scaled it back to 2 properties, there will still be a significant impact upon the trees and upon the habitat.
It will be extensive.
So, I guess the question is, are we concerned enough about that impact to object on that basis, because as Councillor Oakes observes, I think the actual properties themselves, even their location in terms of a couple more properties coming out onto that road, we probably wouldn't have felt that there was a basis for an objection. I might be wrong, I might have misjudged it, but I doubt it. But in terms of its impact, and its considerable impact, what do people feel?
Councillor, there's somebody who might want to say something if you're happy to allow him to.
Can we? We should have given notice.
There's a way of doing it. I'll suspend the meeting just in time to allow you to speak, because it seems entirely sensible to allow you to do so.
It's the access onto the site.
It's a congestion.
It's never shown in any of the plans that have been submitted. It's directly opposite the access to, I think it's house number 3 there. My car was hit last week, and it's a regular thing, and that was just somebody coming down, not even visiting, but came down to turn around. It's a very, very tight, congested area. And the plans of the houses, who's put them in, they've got west elevation, which should be east elevation. There's nothing concrete to get up here. And it is, I fear that if these trees are taken down, it'll also cause subsidence to our house, because we're number 5 there, which is the one right to...
Yeah, I know it is, yeah.
Right.
Sorry.
It's fine, I'll reopen the meeting. So, councillors, views.
Well, my point, I think we made it before, is I think and it's been proven right by taking down the bungalow on East Road, I think, by just past the Laxon Junior, where they're putting property up. When they come to build on a site like that, the construction on a site that large, every single tree will go. There will not be any trees left. Even the ones that have TPOs on them, they will cause so much damage to those trees, they will die anyway. And you can see that, where as soon as they've been big earth moving materials on, you can kiss the whole of that area go. And I think I'm opposed to it, just because they can't build that without destroying all the trees. And the entrance, having now you pointed that out, the entrance to that site is ridiculously small, and it's just too tight. And knowing Pexley Court, that was your road, as I do, having just, 4 more cars. I mean, you can get away with 4 more cars. When some stores came up, we had another car. That would be, but I think it's the habitat destruction and the amount that's my biggest concern anyway.
I don't say, I endorse everything that Councillor Humphrey just said.
Right, I'm just trying to look around the room to see
I don't like the fact that so many trees are going to go, and the wildlife at all. The 2 houses.
Yes. I think I too share the concerns about the habitat impact. And it may be that perhaps I was wrong about what I said about the access and thinking that maybe it wasn't an issue. Clearly I'm not that familiar with having to go in and out of there on a regular basis.
I think that was part of our objection last time with the 3 houses.
Now that you mention it, I have a
Pretty sure we
feeling
mentioned
you might be right, that when we did look at it before, we did, I think, make a point about access. Right, I'm getting a distinct flavour here, because everybody who's so far spoken seems to be opposed to this. Does anybody actually think that it should get permission?
Well, I don't think it's as disastrous as the picture's being painted. We need more houses in Handel. It's just an extension of the existing space. So I don't know, actually, so I'm probably talking rubbish, but it looks like any other houses down there. Frankly, lose a few trees.
Well, you have
it's
to...
unfortunate, but...
Yeah, well, that's the attitude that creates habitat loss, and, you know...
Well, it is, but unfortunately you've got nearly every house,
but there won't be
large house, has got something built in the back garden.
Yeah, but they're houses for profit, they're not houses for anything else. Of course it is. They're houses for profit at the expense of we've already seen tonight the amount, if we lose Fletton Field, we lose 40% of the green space and habitat space in this town. There is very, very little, or you could say there's masses around it because we're in a rural setting. There are lots and lots of grain fields, but it's all monoculture, it's all mono-agricultural land. There's very, very little wildlife habitat in this town, very, very little. And we should preserve what we've got. And we should think about the residents too. I think that's very important. But you know, you didn't buy a house in Pexley Court. You bought it there because it was a nice place to buy a house. You didn't
We've got
buy it
so
knowing
many
that there would
houses
be.
and gardens that have been full of houses now. We don't seem to be able to object to those. Well, I don't like them.
Well, we do.
No, we have,
We do object to
Some
quite a
of
lot.
Yeah,
Well,
we do.
Right. Well, I hear one dissenting voice, but
well, I
currently
would
hear
dissenting on the resident concerns.
one less convinced voice than perhaps. Do I take it, based on what I've heard so far, that we do object, and essentially we object on the basis of the impact on the removal of trees, the impact on those that are not scheduled to be removed, the loss of habitat, and as a secondary but no less a point, concern about the impact of additional traffic?
Access. I think access is more appropriate than the additional traffic, because I think you're on a losing wicket with that one, because there could potentially not be that many more cars, but it's certainly the access. And as we pointed out, if there's already been a collision at some point.
Okay. So if in talking about traffic movements, it's traffic movements in and out of the development, as it were, rather than anything else. So, is that how we're going to do it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah?
Yep.
Okay. That would seem to be 4. Right. This one is perhaps not quite so controversial as some of the others.
I'm sorry about this. I mean, these are the objections originally, and it talks about 40 odd trees. There's no documentary evidence. It's rather strange promise that they would build, plant 20 trees in the schools road somewhere. But we won't go back up on that. And the fact that they're going to build trees somewhere else is a bit spurious, in my opinion. Well, basically, people are not happy with this at all, frankly.
Right.
Okay.
Okay.
Sorry, mate, I'm trying ever so much to... there we go, no objection to plants and elevation of the houses, but tree loss is substantial. It's pretty long.
Right. Can we move on to 81 West Street, subdivision of a single dwelling into 2 dwellings with associated modifications, which involves a partial demolition of an existing rear extension to create an exterior courtyard, demolition and a replacement of the rear extension. Quite sure how you actually replace the rear extension and demolish it and create a courtyard, but anyway, perhaps it will become more clear.
Some kitchen craft, is that?
Yeah, there's cooking grass is underneath and waterland estates from above. And as well to apologise, I don't like apologising in advance for things, but I had corrupted file on this one. I managed to get the proposed site plan. I downloaded something else and it did some nasty things, so I had to really rejig it. Now, these are the unedited comments. Now, what I would propose to suggest to you is that I'll zoom home this evening and try and reconstruct this and mail it round to all councillors when I've been able to get this corrupted file back. But all you've got to do really is look at that. And I actually read the planning application, and I think that's a fair comment, frankly. Parking is at a premium round there. But I'm afraid I can't do the bits in the middle at the moment, but I'm very happy to mail you in time for us to get something together if people agree, by submission time. Can't say any more. I did my best, but I'd have been struggling for hours trying to sort the original draft file.
I mean, I'm conscious of the fact that this is not a listed building.
It isn't.
But it's in a conservation area.
But it is, as you say, it is in the conservation area. Whether any aspect of how this is to be achieved would impact sufficiently upon the property to make us worried about the impact on the conservation area, I am unclear.
I agree with you.
I'm not convinced that it would have a detrimental impact.
Well, a lot of it will be out of sight.
Yes, and admittedly we have got policies, for example, about certain things in the conservation area,
but
even if they are out of sight.
The property to the right of Food and Craft, it had some substantial alterations. We looked at a planning application on that about 3 years ago, something like that. In the round, I think, to be honest, just flipping through it, really, access and parking is probably the biggest bugbear. And that's already been pointed out by the residents' comment.
I've seen Rebus turning down other, or commenting on other applications and trying to put roof lights on the street.
That's right, yes.
Yes, sir.
I don't know where those roof lights are, the back or front.
Well, this is why I would, I'm desperately anxious to, get back to it and have another look.
So they are on this map. They are on the front on the street side, and it does actually say on the plan 5 conservation style roof lights, as previously approved by the planning application 16/01184.
Yeah, that's the one I looked at before.
But it was approved. They were approved.
Yep, they are.
So the roof light thing is now not dead in the water, as you say. I think the only thing we have to consider once again is parking, access, and
It's making 2 big properties, basically, isn't it?
I mean, they have been 2 big properties.
We've got ground floor, first floor, second floor and roof.
Oh. This takes me back.
Thank you very much.
There's large bits of paper floating around in front of me.
What fun.
Yes.
Is there any parking allocated at all on the site?
I'm just trying to see if it's
I wouldn't want to talk like that.
clear.
You can't see it.
I wouldn't want to talk like about it.
No, that's not.
There will be, because there is, you go down the lane, and there's some double gates there, and there's a garden beyond them. And there is parking facility as well right there. But I'd rather go around there with my camera and, make sure I'm showing my facts. I just whizzed through this, to be perfectly honest, and all of a sudden Mr. Computer decided he was going to have a snooze.
There's adequate parking, so they don't park.
Do we happen to know whether the return date on this is
On this one?
tomorrow, or whether we've got any
Leeway. I think they're a bit embarrassed about this. I don't usually miss things up.
There's a lot to do, as I found out.
I think roof lights have ever been a particular problem in the conservation
Yes,
area.
it's one that I had to get an extension
Solar
on.
panels are.
Roof lights have been a huge problem.
Yeah, but I'm saying that they are not the ones. We don't have a specific policy. We didn't have a specific policy about solar panels years ago, but we do have one now. And it says over our dead body, if you want to put a solar panel up. but I don't think we've got a policy in.
We haven't.
I don't think we have to do with roof lights.
Objected to them.
We might have put in individual objections, but I don't think that's a policy that we've got sitting in our
We've
debate.
certainly commented strongly in the past. And the people in Mill Road have had problems putting them in.
Yeah. Well, one way of dealing with that, because we haven't got the time to play with, would be, I suppose, to indicate that we have a concern about the potential impact on the conservation area, and would ask that the conservation officer considers whether he has a problem with what is proposed in terms of that, particularly the roof light bit.
Yeah.
As to whether or not the parking stroke access issue is sufficiently severe, I don't know. What do people feel? Do we feel that that is likely to be a sufficient issue to object on?
It was when the roof light issue came up. We
Was it?
objected to
Yeah,
parking.
it was.
Yeah, we did. We said the fact that he was putting roof lights in would indicate he was going to create flats, and therefore we had a concern
Yeah.
about parking.
Yeah.
The thing about putting roof lights in is you're basically doing an attic conversion. So you're increasing your livable space.
Yeah, we did object to that on that basis.
But I'm just embarrassed that I haven't really got my idea on this one.
Well, it is what it is. There certainly seems to be some concern. And based on that, the lack of time, and the fact that if we don't object now and feel that we should have done later, it's too late, I'm inclined to say that perhaps we should expand these concerns into an objection, and if at the end of the day the planners take a different view, well, so be it. But I think at least that way we've highlighted our issues.
That's a kind of a conditional objection.
Yeah, I mean, it isn't conditional in the sense that if we object, and it has certain consequences, but I think we probably have to. Right.
I'll still actually, I'll still have a dig at it, because I'll go home now.
I think it would be nice to see it if we got the
If I can
chance.
get something out to you, I'll do that.
Fine. I'm going to suggest we move on. This next
we're
one,
we're nearly halfway through the slides.
yes, it does probably get a little easier at times after this.
It does.
However, this one is interesting. This is 38 West Street, which some of us would know is Coles's Yard, and is for a conversion, alteration and extension of buildings to form 5 dwellings. And it's not the first time that we've seen such a planning application. There was one some years ago, which I think
I've
lapsed.
got it all on here, I promise you.
So Councillor Oakes will enlighten us.
There we go. Well, I'm sure we all know where Colles Yard is, but I'm taking the trouble to, it used to be part of the Union Brewery, and went all the way from West Street all the way down to South Road. It's quite interesting. These are photographs I took just a day or so ago of what exists there. Most of you who have ever been in Colles would know this. And apart from the large building, which you can see in the left, the top left slide, pretty well, that the rest of it's going to get flattened and it's going to be built upon. Okay. Now, the proposed site layout. What's happening there? Oh yes, and that's the building I'm referring to. The original application was 5 years ago. I remember it very well. And at the time, it was proposed to demolish that particular building. Now, there's my comments really, and that comes as a result of having a chat with Richard Coles and about it, and he gave me a really historical lesson about it. But basically, Lloyd Mills didn't like it to be demolished, So that's been taken out of the revised plan, will just sit there. But not all, it'll just be mothballed. Okay. The reason for the resubmission is that Richard and Paddy didn't realise that their planning application would expire in 3 years. They thought it would last 5. The original one, we have no objections. We know that the vehicle movement is going to substantially reduced, for obvious reasons, because they've got lorries going in and out of there all the time during the day, and 5 dwellings with even 2 cars each aren't going to actually deliver that kind of traffic levels. Right. Oh no, this is the next one, sorry. I don't know what really else to say. We had no objection to the original one. They modified it to fall in with the conservation officer by not demolishing that drag building, actually. I don't know what else to say, to be perfectly honest.
Well, if we're going to be consistent, it would seem to be pointing us in a direction. It doesn't mean to say that concerns might not have arisen, but Councillor Oates.
I was just remembering that when it came up last time, there was a concern about the access to those proposed houses. But there is, of course, from South Road, the old track.
There's a pedestrian access.
It's only pedestrian.
Well, no, it's not.
It is.
I don't.
No, the
agree.
track will take a vehicle, but the access onto it is a pedestrian one. Let me just go back.
Okay, it's just that passageway, years ago, that track led up to the back of the old doctor's surgery.
Yeah, that's private now, isn't it?
Do you remember that, Vi? The doctors used to go up there in
Yeah,
their
but
cars,
it isn't
and they all
public.
used to park there.
It isn't, I don't think it's public.
Oh.
The fact that people might have gone there.
The
All I'm really saying is that there is access.
Right.
And I'm trying to go down it and you can't,
I checked on this because it was a possibility that there would be vehicular access. But if you look at the top left photograph, the access to the pedestrian one is to the left of the building that's next to the big one that's not being demolished now. And it's just a gate.
Yeah, but that's his gate to come in from the...
No, it's a pedestrian gate.
Okay.
yeah, it is, it's not.
It's
Just
just
just a point.
you can't drive in there.
Are we worried about something that might potentially not happen if they are just renewing their application, their planning permission? I mean, if they got it
They
5
just
years ago,
slightly adjusted it.
but if they did it 5 years ago and haven't done anything since, are they just keeping their options open?
Yeah, because they're retired.
Yes. I mean, I think it's probably more likely that within the lifetime of this planning permission it will be implemented. But I am conscious of the fact that we didn't object before. I take on board what Councillor Oakes says about traffic movements in and out of the site. Strangely, whilst we probably would have been concerned if this had not had its the commercial use it has, because we'd have been thinking, oh my goodness, all this extra traffic. It is actually almost certainly less traffic.
It's going to be less traffic, yeah.
So, I don't really
Except
see a
when the
basis
building
to
is-
object.
Yes.
Well, I'm afraid that's inevitable, isn't it?
No, I don't.
Oh, well, by the way, I should say that I do obviously have an opinion about that, but I have declared
Yes.
an interest.
Does anybody feel that there is a reason why we should object?
No, I don't think so.
No, all right, let's mark that one as no objection. Thank goodness for that. So, this one actually might be less difficult as well, because strangely, this talks about replacing a garden fence with a garden wall. And it is a listed building, but the idea is to put a limestone wall up instead of a fence, which sort of sounds as if it's likely to improve the visual amenity of the property.
You'll see that from the photograph. By the way, I've merged the two together. There's the LBC application and a TCA one.
Yes.
But they're basically the same property, so it didn't make any sense to do them separately. Okay, that's where it is, outlined. That is what it looks like at the moment. And you can see the lovely fence.
Yeah.
Um,
We're going to improve it, can't we?
so, you know, it'd be a bit difficult not to improve that, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Right, elevations, that's the existing elevations, which basically show the fence in brown. And this is what their plan is. So they're going to have some steps coming down, and they're going to put a new bit that comes all the way around, you know. Well, that's what they're proposing to do. Just literally build a limestone wall all around that square stroke rectangle. In limestone, which is suitable material for the kind of property.
Does anybody object?
Right,
Right.
let's just get
The
to
trees.
bit, and here we
Because
are.
this is tree removal, so it's not part
Yeah,
of our
exactly.
husbandry approach.
There are two trees, and the reason they want to take them down is because if they didn't, they wouldn't be able to put the foundations in for the new wall. But they do intend to plant fruit trees and other stuff. But that's the reason for it.
Well, it's had a good sense to ask. Yeah, it'd be
Got
reasonable.
very well said.
Yes.
But we never liked trees being felled.
This looks to me like a fairly standard no objection, subject to the view of the tree officer. I'd be surprised if he objected. Looking at what they are, where they are, why they would go, and looking at the thing holistically, it seems to me to make sense.
I don't understand the importance of a eucalyptus globulus or a bird cherry. I've actually got a book on trees now, and I really ought to look that up.
They're probably grown up, they're very attractive garden trees, in fact, eucalyptus and bird cherry, because of the blossom on bird cherry and the colour, leaf colour on the eucalyptus. But I think if, whenever we get these, whenever we know that Henry Pearson's involved in it, then if he gives his approval, then he's a good guy to see it.
Okay.
It's not like
So-
Legos or something.
No,
is it?
exactly.
Yeah.
Natural
And if they've done that,
Yes.
I can imagine that if they've already got them in the garden, they said the beauty of the tree, I can imagine they will replant once the wall.
That is the intention. I didn't want to say that they would,
Yeah.
but that, I believe,
I would imagine that.
I believe it's their intention.
On the basis they're effectively ornamental trees.
They are, and they want to reserve that kind of feeling.
Yeah. Okay, no objection, subject to the views of the tree officer. Now, another interesting one, 91 South Road, demolition of existing dwelling, construction of a 2.5-storey dwelling. I don't know why we got this trend for 2.5-storey dwellings, but anyway, a 2.5-storey dwelling with detached single-storey outbuilding and garage to include revised vehicular access. And this is a reapplication.
It is. Right, this is the place as was. Right. The site plan's there, you can get the general idea, you can see the existing one, and you can see what they're supposed to do on the right-hand side. Well, it's pretty substantial. I mean, they're going to knock a bungalow down and then build a big
Can you show me the other side again, so that I
Sorry?
see which bungalow it is? Because I think they're already doing it.
They have,
They've
it's
got-
nearly
I'll come
done.
to that.
They're up
I
to the
will
roof.
come to that.
They've got the roof trussers on site.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's all been on, because I was down there on
Yeah.
Sunday.
No,
The amendment is just moving up into the roof, that's all it is, isn't it?
Councillor Chester, I will come to that, I promise you.
Right.
Okay, these are the original street scenes, then we've got all the materials stuff. In other words, it basically, you know, we didn't moan about this at all.
No.
And I did check, and the neighbours didn't seem to be overly bothered about it either. But basically, it's, you know, going to be a pretty substantial building. And there we are.
It's further
I
than
did
that.
tell you, Councillor Chester.
I've been driving
Apparently
past
you've
that every day
You become councillor Stagg, actually. No, there are, that's where we are, okay, that photograph was taken, you know, 2 days ago, 3 days ago, something like that. So you can say that they're well on their way, but in fairness, they did get planning permission via a previous one, and they just made some minor adjustments on this. Now, right, I think this is significant disappointment from our point of view, right, because the apartment has been demolished. It's an important part of the street scene. No, this is what we said in May 2019.
It just shows how much they
They've
don't
taken
take any
loads of
notice
it
of
away
what's
and
all.
they've chucked it
We might as well
away.
not exist.
Right, I'm just saying, I'm just putting it up, okay? And there they are. Now, the submitted block plan shows the walls intact. As you
So
can
that's
see.
the one planning commission was a bit of grass.
That, well, who knows? But that shows those walls are intact. But they've actually knocked them down, as you can see.
But we should be able to check.
There we go, look, these are the walls in the situ in 2015. So I managed to do that. You can see they've entirely removed the one on the left, and they partially, well, quite significantly removed a bit on the right, as you can see. Well, I feel a bit miffed about that, because it actually was our chairman who actually made this point. And they were part of the vernacular.
There might be a
I
rebuilding.
think they're rebuilding it. Yeah, I think they are.
Well, I'll tell you what, I'd be lovely to wander in there and find out if the builders have actually, you know, hung on to the stone. They're going to put it up again. I don't think so.
Can I
But the fact is that they've flown in the face of a requirement that we put in.
Well, of course, I suppose it's not a question of what we have, of course, haven't got the power to put in a requirement. We could ask ENC to put in the requirement. The question is whether ENC did. If they did, and if despite that, that wall has been substantially removed, then of course it would be entirely reasonable for us to go to enforcement and say they've got to reinstate. We could probably check to see what the terms of the original permission that they had was.
Yeah, I can have a look.
Well,
See if they
ring the enforcement officer up
and
and
see
say,
if there was a condition imposed, because if there was one, it's certainly been breached. But if there wasn't one, all we could do would be to request, I suppose, that when they finish the construction, they consider reinstating the wall to restore the street scene broadly to what it was before. Well, if they agreed, I mean, it's what we asked, but as I say, whether what we asked was actually carried through by ENC, off the top of my head, I don't know. And of course, what we tend to see, in terms of our responses, is we're told granted, but we don't tend to make a detailed note for obvious reasons of all the planning conditions that may or may not be imposed, because otherwise, if we started setting those out in our minutes, the already voluminous minute would become even longer to do.
I think we at least should put a protest in.
Well, as I say, it seems to me that this is something which we can do in two ways. First of all, if there was a condition along the lines as we requested, then it's clearly been breached. That's a matter for enforcement. If there wasn't, then what we could do is say that we are disappointed that, notwithstanding the observations that we made, this has happened, and we would ask that they consider reinstating the wall so far as is practicable to restore the street scene as much as they can.
I think that's fair.
So I think we can do that. Leave aside the issue of the wall at the moment. There isn't really anything else to talk about, is there?
They've done some fiddling about with the design, but there's nothing, you know.
Nothing that is likely to cause us
not
concern.
compared to the, you know, the whole business of
all right, so
and then putting on a 2.5 stone a story.
if we ask Lisa to check it out and find out what the position is, and you can go one way or the other depending on what you find out.
Yeah.
Right.
If you're busy, Lisa, I'm happy to do that. Just let me know.
Okay, I'll have a look
I'll
tomorrow.
leave
Yeah.
you two of you to sort it out. Right, Oundle School Rugby Pavilion, presumably not the pavilion itself, bearing in mind we're talking about some tree husbandry, it would appear, so
That's
that's
what I've got.
something remarkable.
You just do that. Tree husbandry.
That's fine, Barry.
No, but honestly, I've gazed at this for quite some time, and it took me ages to find out where number 217 and 184 were. And to this day, I haven't got a clue where they sit in relation to the rugby pitch. Well, that's going to get shifted anyway after they've demolished the swimming pool. So at the moment, I don't know what to say, but it is husbandry and it's not felling.
Our experience of the school is that they're pretty responsible in their
They are.
They are.
And bearing in mind our policy is that we would not normally object to husbandry, and this appears to be no more than that. I would suggest that we just don't object.
I'm happy with that, Jen.
Right, on to 114 South Road, taking
Right,
down
we've
a
got
conservatory
15
to
to
put
go
up another one.
We've only got 15 to go. Yeah.
I think
15
you exaggerate.
sides, that is. Look, this is I don't know what to say about this. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. You can see the potential for the extension. You can see it's a proposed extension, and you can see that bit above the main house. Not much more to say about it really. Let me go into this next bit. Plan and elevation. That's the existing bit. It's not overlooked. It's actually hidden away. I don't know what else to say really. These are the plans and elevations that are proposed.
It's not like a little lane, isn't it? It's actually not on South Road itself.
It is. You go up a little track and past two houses to get to it. Yeah. I mean, it's really not hidden away. And nobody, for example, from West Street or whatever else can see it or anything like that.
You can't
it's even if you came, I think if you came down, even if you came down Danfords, you wouldn't see it from there. Okay. Right. I suppose that's pretty well part of the course.
Don't think I've got any objection. Anything from the neighbours?
No objections. The usual caveat.
Usual caveat. I haven't seen anything about it which would suggest that there's any reason at all for us to object to this.
I think you'd actually improve it.
It might well.
But there we go.
No objection?
No.
No objection. Move on to 68 Clapthorne Road. First floor extensions to both side and rear. Replacement of flat roof to include roof lantern and parapet to side elevation. Erection of new porch. Re-roofing of existing pitched roof. And this seems to be, as it puts it here, a revised scheme to a previous approval.
Yeah.
I must admit, I don't remember it first time around specifically, but...
I do, but I'm just saying that, look, you can see where it is. It's opposite Tilly Hill Close. It's a decent sized site. And you can see what they've proposed to do, which is basically a wraparound. There it is.
I actually walked past this one today to have a look at it when I got this and looked up because it's quite close. And the other houses in the row have all had a similar thing done to them already.
They have.
So in fact, what it is going to make it will make that row of houses compatible rather than.
It'll sort of fit in better.
So it'll have a positive impact on the street scene rather than a negative one.
We can hardly object, we haven't objected to the other ones.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
No objection.
But, there we go. There are the floor plans, so if you wish to see them. That's existing, and then you can see the extra bit that's been bolted around it. Well, I don't have any objection, but...
Anything from the neighbours again?
No. Subject to the usual.
No objection? I think so. Right, Overwell House, Mill Road.
Oh, sorry, these are the innovations, if you did want to see them. That's what the proposal is.
Well, the next three are all trees, aren't they?
The next three are all trees, so it does speed up as we go.
I'm winding you
This would appear to be tree husbandry again, rather than removal.
Right.
A lot of trees have been removed from the front garden there.
From Overwell?
Overwell, yes.
Yeah, I believe they have.
Yeah.
Over quite a period of time.
No, recently.
Oh,
Recently.
I took a photograph of it ages ago when I was looking at the Yankee Brewery.
No,
I should have really...
A lot have been removed. I was trying to buy that property.
Really?
Yes. Anyway, I didn't get it. But
And I'm sure it doesn't colour your view in any way.
So I've noticed the activity in there, and there's a lot of trees have gone from the front there.
Oh, well, that's interesting. All I'm just putting up here is what a crown lift is. I mean, basically, it's tree husbandry again, really. So he's not felling.
Well, there's some substantial trees in the front garden. I mean, I can see why they did it, because they're in a lot of way,
but I mean, look, that's a crown raise. Basically, it take away the lower branches. I always thought, as a rather strange thing, I always thought that a crown one would be taking it down from the top. But actually it isn't, it's the other way around. Don't know what to say about it really. We're going to be saying, subject to the views of it.
Tree husbandry policy is not to object, unless there seems to be a good reason to, which I do not see.
Mr Pearson is on the case.
And he will be on the case, so no objection.
Is he aware that some trees have gone?
Well, we could make an observation that we would want to check that no trees that were subject to Tree Preservation Office orders have been removed.
I think he's only within post for 18 months. I'm not on very good terms with the previous tree. Tree lady.
They probably did a lot of garden work and then decided those three were actually the ones that they could get in trouble with if they did do something.
Yeah.
And then they suddenly thought, oh, we better get permission for this, because I think we'll,
Yeah, well, I think they are subject to TPOs, hence the application.
Well, I get a good box tick just for replying.
Yes. And talking of applying, let's move back to South Road and number 43. This is in fact removal of 2 trees,
right,
I believe.
No, there's not much you can say about this.
It might be 3, it might be 4 trees.
Damage. And we're talking about some replacements. Don't know what else to say, really.
Nothing.
This one, because it involves removal,
Oh,
You see,
yes.
you see the blue dots? Those are the trees that are affected by this.
Tree officer.
yeah.
Tree officer.
This sounds like no objection subject to any contrary view of the tree officer, which would be our standard response to a removal request.
But,
Unless we knew that we did want to object.
Literally, isn't it?
Right. This is the removal of yet another tree, this one at 15 Mill Road, a property which we seem to come across quite regularly.
This is the end, really again. I'm so familiar with this now, it's ridiculous. So there it is. A little bit dot. Now I just thought I'd put a little bit of interest in this, because I've been getting into the trees these days. Now look at them, they're very old.
So is it an atomic bomb attack? You can find
Yeah, it's advanced, the atomic bomb in Hiroshima. Can you believe it? But that's what it looks like. It's also known as the maiden pair.
Definitely
I
got to
have
go
one
to
in
the
my
tree
garden.
officer.
Have
Do
you?
you really? I had to look it up.
lots of
Mine came from Peckover House.
Oh.
Yeah.
Peckover House. Well, I know a little bit about the Peckovers, that's interesting. Right. Look, what can you say? I haven't got a picture of the specific tree. That is not the tree. It's merely what I pulled off the internet.
I was going to say that's what
Yes,
we
it's
need
a
to-
generic tree rather than a specific one.
I just sort of interest. It's very, I don't like going onto properties without
The
permission.
school car park
Sorry?
The school car park, the one behind, the music department.
Gascoigne.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
the Gascoigne
Yeah.
has some very good ginkgos.
Oh, right.
If you want to see
Well,
ginkgo.
Because it's difficult to take a
They're
photograph.
very rare, I mean, we're exceptionally lucky in Arundel that we've actually got some.
But they've hung on gridly after Hiroshima. But I couldn't take a photograph, you see, from the ground. I don't think I have need to take permission to get
Well,
permission.
I'm conscious of what Councillor Chesser has just said. Therefore, I'd be more inclined to go the other way and to say that we do object,
Yeah,
Okay.
unless the tree officer considers that the removal is essential.
Absolutely.
Because, you know, these are nice trees, they're apparently quite rare.
They're rare to Arundel, like the Scots pines.
Limited number of them in Arundel, unless you want to go into Councillor Chesser's garden or the Gascoigne car
Because I
park.
think we should try to get more parking
And there's
space.
there's one
Ah.
actually in West Street, in one of the
I
gardens.
agree with you. Parking spaces.
I just wished I had gone in, but I never take photographs
Where-
on
where,
private property.
Where Sue was talking about the path coming up from South Road.
Yes.
Yeah.
There's a fantastic ginkgo in there.
Oh, right, okay.
So I'm going to record object unless the tree officer considers removal essential.
Yeah.
I think that's
I'm
excellent.
pretty sure now the amount of work that's been happening on that building and in that it's in the way of parking. It's just in the
Well,
way.
we
It's
so
proximity to building rubbish.
yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, if the tree officer considers that that is rubbish, I suspect he may very well object to it himself.
Well, I mean, obviously we've had, I don't know how many applications we've had go through for a brewery.
Goodness, I wish I
It's
counted
running
them up.
into quite a lot now.
Happily,
I would have liked to have actually taken a photograph of it, but I do not venture onto private property without them.
Right.
Giving me permission.
well, a somewhat more public building is the last one on our list, and this is Unit 3 at the Wharf. A change of use from the existing Class B2 general industrial to mixed use, including retail, health and fitness studios, storage, etc., and a change of use to retail on the ground floor.
So this is a planning application for a yoga studio, which my wife's going to go to at 9:30 tomorrow.
Very interesting.
Can I just say, you know,
This is retrospective.
it's an absolutely retrospective. That's the only thing I put up on it. That this is just a consolidation of what has already taken place.
That's why the parking's got worse down there then.
Right, well,
I don't know what else to say.
however we respond, we will refer to our policy on retrospective planning applications.
Well, it might be
It's
a
great
change
into
of
the building.
use.
No, it's not a retrospective.
Sorry, can I?
It's not, it doesn't say anything about retrospective, and you've got until the 18th of November to put your reply in. So,
But which
I'm not-
bit of the building is it in? Because
First
we
of all,
could be looking at change of use.
Well, it says it's a change of use.
It is change of use.
Um,
But I mean, have they got it if they're opening tomorrow?
well, no, they went last week,
but there's nothing on there that
I
says
mean,
retrospective.
retrospective
No,
is one thing,
but then-
actually putting it to use.
yes.
uh,
Not all retrospective applications, of course, describe themselves as being retrospective applications, perhaps because they know that it's going to make us cross.
I think they just scrabbled to just.
I mean,
dot the
we can
I's
certainly
and cross the
make
T's.
the point that we believe that the application may be retrospective, at least in relation to some elements of it.
Change of use being one of them.
Well, that particular change of use, because it's a multiple changes of use. I mean, it's not just one change of use, there's a raft of different changes of use being proposed here. Though, having said it,
It does say change of use.
it does seem to me that, within reason, it probably doesn't matter very much what they do, as long as it does something. I mean, that site has become part of the sort of commercial part of the town, even though it is isolated from the rest of it. But it's carved its sort of little niche out with the businesses it has. It's got the benefit of the tap and kitchen on site as well. I doubt that we would actually have very much concern about any of these.
I thought the only concern is that they didn't ask us.
Other than the fact that if it is retrospective, then we would deprecate the fact that they might have implemented the change first and asked later. So we could ask the planners to check out whether it is, and make clear to the applicant that in future, if they have further applications to make, they put them in before they do it, not afterwards.
My only small caveat is that it looks an awful lot better than it used to. With those corrugated rusty buildings. And
yes, there's no doubt.
That's not a good reason to.
Yeah.
What surprised me at this one was that it was down as changing from B2 general industrial. Well, it's been retail for the last 5 years. You know, so they're saying that they didn't have planning permission.
Yes,
either.
I mean, it may well be that somebody has just actually cottoned on to the fact that they didn't seek a change of use when they did the conversion.
I would say that's almost certainly the case.
Or that it's been drawn to their attention. In any event, as I say, perhaps all we should be doing is saying, look, to the extent it's retrospective, we would deprecate
The most exciting slide of the night.
Right. Well, I'm relieved at that because we're already at 9:30. However, there isn't much else to go. There are some planning outcomes. You'll notice that despite the fact that there are a number of red bits, as it were, where we were making more extensive comments, the response of ENC to each of the applications considered was to grant them. That includes the Rugby Club, of course, which we have a certain interest in. But more particularly, it also includes the Angel. And as you will see, under the issue planning appeals, of which, as far as I'm aware, there are none, actually, that's not strictly true. There is one, because there was the one I referred to earlier, which was the application that was refused.
Cotterstock Road.
On Cotterstock Road, which isn't mentioned there, but as I said earlier, they did not get their permission. Quite an interesting read. But you'll notice that we've put to discuss a decision relating to the Angel Inn change of use. I don't know how many times we've used the expression judicial review during the course of the last few weeks, but I would just observe that, as far as I can see, the only way in which the decision of the planners could be challenged would be by way of judicial review, and there would have to be a legal basis for doing it. And the mere fact that they did it when we think they shouldn't have done it isn't, unfortunately, of itself a basis for us to try and put a spanner in the works. And the advice I would give is that I don't think, on planning grounds, there's anywhere else left for us to go. What, of course, is interesting is the fact that although access at the front is onto the public highway through what was the front door to the public house, there is, of course, a rear access to the property which comes out into our car park and onto land that we own but which we lease to the co-op. And the terms of the lease to the co-op are quite prescriptive because it is leased to them so that it can be used as a car park for the use of private motor vehicles. And of course, what is being proposed is that vehicles associated with a funeral parlour, to wit hearses and associated vehicles, would be coming and going. Now that looks like, if it were the co-op that were trying to do it, and I know we have certain arrangements with the co-op that were built in, but if they were sort of trying to do that, we'd perhaps be pointing out to them politely that that area is supposed to be used for what I might call non-commercial purposes, which begs the question as to whether or not there is any basis for this council turning around to the people who have put in and got their planning to say, well, that's all very well, but you have no permission from us to come and go through that rear access. Now, it raises all sorts of interesting issues, because clearly the Angel has been there as a pub for some considerable time, and when the Mayor and I were batting emails back and forth the other day with regard to this, I said, well, it seemed likely that, as they themselves asserted, that essentially they had some rights because they'd been exercising them for ever and a day, to which the Mayor observed that in his view they hadn't, because he felt that all the deliveries in fact were made to the front of the premises, not through that rear entrance, and that access and egress to the property from there was used by private cars for the people running the pub. I'll let Councillor Chesser in.
Lots of deliveries took place through those gates at the back. And what used to happen was the vehicle came in, backed the wrong way up our one-way bit of parking across the disabled car places, parking slots, and then backed into the two gates, to the iron gate that they put in. And what didn't ever happen was that no customers in cars ever went across that area, ever. They never went in the back.
Well,
only ever a dray, effectively.
Yeah, my belief of the dray deliveries were generally to the front door. You know,
but I would have to admit that I've seen many going at the back. But never, ever, ever any other customers.
They're talking about 8 vehicles a day, you know, coming in.
Yeah, well, that would be one a week.
Yeah.
So,
now,
I agree with you, see, very limited.
All of this begs a certain question. I mean, A, this is a planning meeting rather than a full council meeting. And my own view would be that if the council, as the owners of the site and the landlords of the co-op, wanted to pursue this further, and I choose my words with a degree of care, not least because we are being recorded, that this should probably be a decision taken, or any decisions that are to be taken should be taken in full council, though full council might be interested to know what the planning committee's view is. But the planning committee's view on planning grounds is that there isn't anything we can do about it, it seems to me. However, the wider issue does exist. And I must admit, part of my email exchange with the Mayor was along the lines of, if we are going to pursue this matter, it might be very useful to find out what the position of the co-op is in relation to all of this, since as far as the Mayor could recall, they did not object to what was proposed as part of the planning application, which you might have thought they might have done. Now, it may be that we as their landlords might wish to draw their attention to the provisions of the lease that surround the use of the car park and ask them very specifically to address their minds to it, because I suspect that what happened is they thought, it doesn't actually matter to us what's happening there, and therefore probably didn't actually pay it any attention, though I may be doing them a disservice. But it seems to me that one thing that we could perhaps suggest and could initiate as a decision of this committee would simply be to make contact with the co-op to see if we could ascertain before the next full council meeting what their view is, and whether they would be willing to potentially pursue this matter further. I can again use a relatively neutral expression.
Okay.
But that's sort of my personal view, and it may be that others have a different opinion.
Well, just a point. I mean, I think now it's been granted. I think that fact impinges on the request we had last time for the public conveniences. be turned into a shop.
It's funny you should mention that, because that was going to be my part 2, but you've
But
anticipated
that
me.
seems to be the next big problem, because that will muddy that area considerably with vans and parking and entrance to it, and I think it should be brought up in full council at some point about how rigorous we are in that use of that car park, because it is now. When I went down there today, there were 4 vans parked out the back of the Angel of working vans, small panel vans, and 2 of them were Stamford Memorial vans, which I suddenly thought, oh, so they're in there not doing stonework, they're gravestone carvers. So there's actually another, there's another element to this. So there's lots of vehicles happening into this place.
And where they were in the backyard of the
Yeah.
Angel, actually inside the
They
gate.
were in the gates and where you park where the disabled bays are.
But that's not all disabled.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they shouldn't be.
It shouldn't be.
So there's and if the
They-
public convenience turns into a shop
That'll be
and they take
worse.
over a bit more, and there's a van for the shop because the shop will have a van, you can guarantee that. And it just bigger.
Yeah.
I think it's something that we need to discuss.
I agree. I think that there are implications for the discussions we had the other day in council with regard to the approach that was made to us in regard to the public conveniences.
So the only question now is whether we tell the current owners and ENC that we're taking this, we're looking for advice on it.
So which current owners?
The current owners of the Angel.
Oh, current owners, sorry.
So my view is we've got more chance of doing something if we stop them before they spend a lot of money on it than after.
They're
But
already working
it's not.
inside.
I mean, we could potentially, but I think it's difficult because I think that it should really be a full council decision, although I understand why the mayor is champing at the bit slightly. But I don't think there can be an awful lot of doubt that the vehicles that Councillor Humphreys has just described as being at that location clearly had to drive through our land to get there, seem to have parked partially on our land, etc., when it's not for that purpose.
Yeah.
And nobody's even asked us for permission, which would have been an interesting issue of itself, bearing in mind the terms of the lease as to whether actually we could grant permission.
Yeah.
And indeed, whether indeed the co-op could grant permission, because arguably, as they are only the tenant of it, they'd have to consider asking us whether they could give permission.
Yeah.
So there's a whole raft of issues in there, but my sort of general feeling is it really ought to go off to full council. But I just think the one thing that we could perhaps initiate is an approach to the co-op. But I suspect local management would need to go right over their heads to wherever they're managed from. But it may be that if we asked the local people who we should raise this issue with, we could be referred on to them. Councillor Oates.
I actually really understand about this. They've granted this willy-nilly. Now we must be able to have a go at them about this. They've not consulted with us. They've granted it. They've granted this permission. They've not spoken to us about our involvement and indeed ownership, if you like, of that area, nor that we very carefully thought out. We've not just sort of said we don't like this in a fit of pique. Now, I have a feeling that they might have gone ultra vires on this. I think they've gone beyond the right way to go about that particular planning application. But the trouble is, I'm not entirely sure how we can get at them. But I think we ought to. That is my feeling. My gut feeling is this is a disgrace. They've not come to us, had a chat, and said, oh yes, you've got a good point there. None of that. They've just gone, we'll grant it. Thank you and good night, Josephine. And you then start to wonder whether there's a hand in the pocket somewhere. I know I'm on tape.
Not doing any of that, but
Before we go too far down that road, could I just observe that we've already said at an earlier meeting this evening, and I must have used that phrase a few times, that there is to be a meeting between this council and the chief executive of ENC. It seems to me that we could broaden the agenda of that meeting, because part of it, and the main focus of it, is on the local plan. But I do think that we have a particular concern about this decision. It's not the only one we've had concerns about, but we certainly have concern about this decision. I would have to observe that, of course, councillors will recall that when this application first went in, ENC did point out to the applicant that they had to go to us in our capacity as the landowners and draw that to our attention and so on. So, of course, we had the opportunity as landowners to say what we wanted to say. And, of course, we know that it is possible for planners to grant planning permission without taking into account potential private law rights, which might enable somebody to say, well, you may have got planning permission, but you still can't do it, chum, because. And we may potentially be in that boat.
But I should have come up and they did the searches of the building.
Well, I'm sure that when they were actually looking into it, they would have looked into the ownership of the car park and rights of way and so on. But of course, the search of the land registry would show up the lease. They could have obtained a copy of the lease and so on. So they may very well have got all of that material, and they may have taken a view on it. Indeed, they clearly have taken a view, because the view they clearly took was that there was an established use, and it was really on the fact that there was an established use that enabled them to argue, as part of their planning application, that that wasn't going to be an issue. Albeit that, as I say, it seems to me technically it's probably not a planning ground. But what annoys us, I suspect, is that we put forward quite a considered raft of objections to this, and it really doesn't appear as if they were accorded any great weight. Now, at the end of the day, all we can do is be consulted and put forward our opinion. And if they choose to ignore it, then they can. But they do actually have to at least consider it. What I don't know, and I'm not in a position to say, is whether they went through a proper process of considering it. Now, one would anticipate that the committee that decided it were made aware of not only the fact of the objection, but also the reasons for it. And if they took the view that, notwithstanding that, they were minded to grant permission, I doubt that there's anything we can do around the planning decision. That's why I sort of said what I've said. Doesn't mean to say we can't raise our concerns about how that came about as part of that process I described, but I think we can also do the other things that I've talked about.
Yeah, okay.
What I'm quite keen on the idea of doing, however, is saying that it's now 10 to 10.
Sorry, David.
And not only are we here, but we've got a paid member of staff who's going slightly above and beyond by still being here at this time. So unless...
Two very quick ones then.
Right. In relation to this, or in...
The other one is we've had correspondence PGR, and that
right, so that's part of the any other relevant matters.
Yeah.
So have we finished the Angel?
The Angel one I've got enough.
Right.
I can go.
What I'm going to do is I'm going to do what I normally do, which is go around the room. However, since I know that you're going to raise something, what I will do is look at everybody else first. Oh, sorry, Councillor Yang. I forgot you were sat over there for a minute. Councillor Humphreys.
I have a concern. I've been walking up and down the Herne, the untarmacked part, which is past the school,
Yeah.
all the way down, and I see that the school, Prince William School, has now erected, I presume it's County Council, some very, very powerful, very high fencing. I presume it's to stop the pupils from escaping. That's what it looks like. But the thing is that it's encroached upon the actual bridle way. So it's some feet out from the actual hedge line, if you like, which has always been so that part of it is on the left, and you can see the existing width of the bridleway, and then suddenly you come to this green, very, very strong fencing which has been put up, metal fencing.
Right.
I'll be down there with my camera immediately.
Right, that would be
I
splendid.
think that
You won't miss
clearly
it. No,
it's an NCC issue, isn't it? Because it's a bridleway
A bridleway.
rather than being a planning, ENC planning authority issue.
Well, the thing is, though, that
Whether it required planning permission as well, it might be another.
the bridle way is in its own kind of way a listed monument.
Yeah. Now, there's the same fencing that they've put round the rest of the school.
They should not have encroached on it.
No.
We've had lots of conversations about an A605 drop-off point. And I pointed out to them on many occasions to say, look, you can't touch this because it's an historic monument. You're going to have to go through the whole 9 yards with historic England and goodness knows what else. And if they'd done that, that's very important. Well, no.
Let's take a picture to support an approach to the relevant officers at NCC as a start point, and then we'll report back further.
I'll do what I can, just to do a bit of digging.
Fine, thank you. Good point.
No, thank you.
Mr. Oates.
Okay.
Just my bad.
I don't now go to the Mayor because I know the Mayor, again, has been making me aware of certain issues with regard to PGR.
So there's been a situation that's been going on before I got involved in the council. PGR felled some trees at the end of the industrial estate, claimed that they've been occupying the ground for over 12 years.
Which they haven't, couldn't they?
Which they haven't. So Sue, what's Sue's name with the council? Sue Scott,
Sue Scott, she's the enforcement officer.
Got onto the case very well.
She's good, Sue.
Yeah, no, Sue's it looks like she's been having a rough time over the issue. So they are now claiming that they have been in. They've got more signed statements that they were occupying it. The maths are stupid. One guy said they've been occupying it for 15 years, which takes them 3 years before they even built on the site. But it's really a case now of what Arundel Town Council can do now to support Sue on this one. But sadly, I only found out about this purely by chance. There were no updates, but at the end of September, she'd had a meeting with the Southams, who were representing PGR. There's a letter on the website there from Southams, which isn't very pleasant at all.
What would she like? What sort of help would she?
Well, I just waiting for a feedback now on this of what we need to do next. I've asked her to keep Arundel Town Council informed of the situation, the very blatant violation of the planning permission. We've spent a lot of time on the herb gardens and the fence and so on there, and it looks like he either never built it or tore it down straight away.
There will be records at the county council.
Yeah,
Because the building was 605.
Yeah, no, there's certainly the records of what we agreed is all clear there.
Yeah.
And he claims that he never put it up. From day one, he was violating the planning permission. But he does this as if it's something to be proud of.
Yeah.
And he's
That sounds to me as if we ought to have a meeting between the council, probably represented by the Mayor and Sue Scott. Primarily, I would suggest for us to ask what are ENC doing about it. And whilst I hate this idea that we're going to get into a permanent confrontation with the ENC, I have to say that if we don't think that their response is appropriate or adequate, I'll mention the Ombudsman word again, because ultimately they have to do their job, and we'll get to the impression that because this is proving tricky, it's being swept under the carpet. Now, I hope that's not right, but it's the impression I get from what I'm hearing. And I think, therefore, we should have a meeting, a kind of clear-the-air meeting between the Town Council, which wants to express its view that if ENC impose planning conditions, we expect them to do whatever is necessary to enforce them. And if this sounds a bit like 15 West Street all over again, you know, so be it.
It's very important because it does seem as if they're sweeping stuff under the carpet to clear the decks before they don't exist anymore.
Well, exactly. And
maybe
of
so.
course, it's NCC who probably carried out that tree clearance, not ENC.
We know NCC chopped the trees down on the road.
Sorry?
We know NCC chopped the trees down on the
NCC
road.
did it, yeah, not ENC.
Because they said those trees that just aligned with this patch were all dead.
Oh, it was shocker.
Yeah. Anyway, so I'll get in touch with Phil on that.
All right, so
the other one very quickly.
Can we authorise the Mayor to do that?
Definitely.
Because it's a planning issue, so I think this
Well,
committee
delighted.
can ask the Mayor to do
I'd
it.
love to just sit here.
Right,
So the other one
second
is,
point.
again, it's planning related. East Road, the little development where the bungalow's been knocked down and the 4 houses are going to be built on there. The builders are making a right mess of the green verge, the other side of the road.
Absolutely.
They're parking on it. So we need, I think, to write to them either to stop doing it or to pay for the restoration of it when they're
I
finished.
think so. Did the same thing on
Okay,
Blackpool Road.
I think it would be reasonable for us to write. I suggest that we copy that letter to ENC's planning department and tell them that we will advise them of any response, and if we do not get an adequate response, ask for the district council's help.
They're
To try and
actually
resolve
double
the issues.
parking in
This-
the road
Oh,
today.
This did come up when we went through that planning
Remember.
application.
I remember we were worried about it at the
Vehicle
time.
access
Yes.
to the construction work and the proximity to Laxton Junior School and the zebra crossing.
Yep.
Yeah.
They were all parts of our objection to that whole
Yep.
site development. And lo and behold, it's all coming true.
Well, I don't know whether Handel School are going to object, but I did observe the 8-wheel truck today drives into where the kitchens are to reverse onto the site. So he drives into the school, where the children are.
Really?
So that's the
Yeah,
Handel School,
well,
I think.
Yeah, perhaps the school needs to have a letter as well.
It's sad. Okay.
Usually it's just
Right.
unusual. They do the same thing in Broome.
If I bring this gavel down now, we'll manage to do it just before 10 o'clock tonight, which bearing in mind I would like to go home, eat, and then I've got to draft about 4 responses to planning applications. I am going to close the meeting.
Well done.